Welcome everyone. Today we'll be having our talk on the socio-economic impact of COVID-19 and the lockdown. And today our speaker will be Professor Arun Kumar, who is currently the Malcolm S. Adiseshaia Chair Professor from the Institute of Social Sciences in New Delhi. So we we uh, we have all known that for the last 1 year that the country has been facing various phases and various levels of lockdown. And one of the crucial questions which is being raised is how is the decisions on these lockdowns are being taken. So should we prioritize the life of the people or should we prioritize the livelihood? So this kind of a binary is being posed in front of us. But behind this binary, there is a huge pain of large masses of people whose livelihoods have been affected by this phenomena. So particularly the migrant laborers uh, whose pains have actually, we have seen them culminating in the streets of the country, and the large sections of MSMEs, their shutting downs and the large unemployment happening in that space, and also the current farmer agitation which is going on in the country amid this lockdown. So in this situation, how should we see the economic impact of this pandemic and the lockdown which has been imposed, citing the pandemic as a reason, and how has it affected the different sections of our society in different ways. So today, speaking on this topic, I'll just introduce Professor Arun Kumar here. So Professor Arun Kumar is currently Malcolm S. Adiseshaia Chair Professor from Institute of Social Sciences, New Delhi. So he's basically an economist who works on development economics and public finance, public policy, and macroeconomics. He has done his PhD in economics from JNU in 1982 and has earlier did his master's in physics from both Princeton and Delhi University. He has held various prestigious positions, one of which was to be part of a team appointed to study the black economy for the Central Board of Direct Taxes. And after that, he has served in many teaching positions across the globe. He has been teaching economics. He was teaching economics in JNU for almost 20 years, from 1985 to 2015. And he has also delivered lectures at different universities globally, such as Yale, Columbia, Carnegie Mellon, and also the University UNAM in Mexico. And the UNAM University in Mexico has awarded him the Ricotta Prize in Economics for his work. And talking about his writings, he has written extensively on globalization and its impact on Indian society and public policy. Some of his books include The Black Economy in India, The Indian Economy Since Independence, Persisting Colonial Disruption, Challenges Facing Indian Universities, and Demonetization and the Black Economy. So his recent book, which came towards the end of the last year, was The Indian Economy's Greatest Crisis, The Impact of Coronavirus and the Road Ahead. So with that, I will welcome our speaker to give his lecture today.
Okay, thank you, Kaushik. And I must begin by thanking the Ambedkar Periyar Study Circle in IIT Chennai for inviting me in your midst. Today I'll be speaking on this socio-economic impact of COVID-19 and the lockdown that followed from COVID-19 and the crisis that it has resulted in the economy and the way ahead. So as a preliminary, what I'll be saying is based on my article written in Economic and Political Weekly, which came out on September 26th last year, and the book, the picture of which is here, which was published in December 2020. And what I'm pointing to is that the crisis facing the Indian economy and society is the greatest challenge that we have seen after independence, because the collapse of the economy was unprecedented. And because of the collapse, the social and the political impact will be long lasting. And that's why we need to see the road ahead as well. Now, as an introduction, the question is, how did the economy run when work had stopped? This is one of the friends of mine. He called me after March 25th when the economy went into lockdown, and he said, how's the economy running if nobody is going to work? So it's true that there were empty roads, the markets were closed, the consumption was declining of diesel and electricity by 30%. And as a result of this closure of work, there's a drastic fall in air and water pollution that we could see. So basically, it showed that economic activity had largely stopped. You had pictures of Himalayas from Jalandhar or of the Kanchenjunga peak from the 250 kilometers away in Bengal. So what it showed was that because the economic activity had largely stopped, the environment had got cleaned up. So the question is that only production of few essential items was allowed. Other than that, everything else came to a standstill. So what does the lockdown imply for society? That becomes the question, because if people are not able to work, not able to go to office, not able to go to factory, then how does the society function? How does the economy function? Now, the government is not admitting the extent of the economic decline. Why is it not admitting? Because you see, as I'll point out, it's the unorganized sector which has been hit hard and the poor who are hit hard. So if the government keeps saying that the economy did not decline very much, then it does not have to do very much for the unorganized sector and the poor. If the government admits that the decline was very sharp and the unorganized sector and the poor have been hit hard, then, of course, the government would be required to do something. But the government doesn't want to do additional spending on the unorganized sector and the poor, so it does not want to admit. Now, the government says that, various organizations, ADB, IMF, World Bank, various experts from various big banks, they're all saying that the economy is not declined much, it will recover very quickly. But as has been our experience, experts are always behind the curve. So, in the 2007, 8, 9 global financial crisis, when the Lehman moment came in September 2008, the IMF was still saying that the economy will grow at 1%, whereas it had already entered recession. Only after the Lehman Brothers collapse did the IMF start admitting that the economy would decline. So usually you see these experts don't want to give adverse information and news, and that's why they don't admit, the extent of the fall that has taken place in the economy when a crisis comes. Now let's look at some of the facts, about the Indian economy. The GDP data is in huge error. I've been pointing out in my work from the time of demonetization that our GDP data measures the unorganized sector by looking at the organized sector. But you see, since the time of demonetization, the unorganized sector is declining, whereas the organized sector is increasing in size. So therefore, organized sector cannot proxy for the unorganized sector. And that's why, the government keeps saying that, things are not as bad because they're not looking at the unorganized sector at all in their data. The quarterly data that comes is based entirely on the organized sector data except for agriculture. And as I'll point out, even in agriculture, there was a bit of a problem. So in the Q1, when the government said that the economy had declined by 23.9%, actually the decline was around 50% because the unorganized sector is not captured in the 23.9% decline. That represents only the decline of the organized sector because the data is only of the organized sector. Now, in this 23.9% decline, the government says that the agricultural sector grew at 3.4%. But the problem is that the agriculture data also was the sowing data, and it was assumed that the targets have been fulfilled. Whereas we know that the targets could not be fulfilled because half of agriculture consists of floriculture, pisciculture, horticulture, poultry, milk, etc. And you know that the demand for milk declined dramatically because weddings were postponed, because the hotels and restaurants, which are bulk consumers of milk, they were closed. The sweet shops were closed. So even in agriculture, even the milk target could not be fulfilled. Similarly, the eggs, because 1 crore eggs are used per day in our midday meal scheme, and the midday meal scheme had closed because the schools were closed, and therefore even the egg production came down. And chicken were culled because people were not eating chicken because people thought that that was the way of transmission of the virus. So therefore, chicken and egg production, that means the poultry production also came down. Similarly, horticulture, that is vegetables and fruits, they were not coming to the cities and they were rotting in the field. So in my book, I've shown data that in the largest wholesale market in North India, which is the Azadpur Mandi in Delhi, was getting half the fruits and vegetables that were coming in the year before at that point of time in March, April of the 2019 compared to 2020. So even the fruits and vegetables are rotting in the field, and therefore their production also came down. So instead of the agriculture production rising by 3.4%, my argument is that it declined by at least 10% during that period. So this shows that even the data that could have come from the unorganized sector was not correctly used in the system. The other thing that this graph shows is that actually the economy was already in trouble for 8 quarters prior to the pandemic. The quarter April to June quarter of the pandemic. For 8 quarters, the economy had been on the decline. Its quarterly rate of growth had come down from about 8%, 8 quarters back to about 3.1%. So there was something going wrong, and then the pandemic hit, and really the economy collapsed at that point of time. Now the government says in Q2 of the last year, the economy had recovered, but my argument is it has not recovered, and I'll come back to that question a little later. So what are the imperatives of the lockdown? Now, the lockdown is not a solution to the disease. The problem is that this virus, the coronavirus, the SARS-CoV-2, that is a very virulent virus. It spreads very rapidly, and it goes from one person to the next person. So there's a human transmission that's taken place. It has jumped from some animal in the Wuhan wet market to human beings, and then it has been transmitted from human to human. So the only way to stop the rapid spread of the disease is so that people don't mix with each other. And that's why the lockdown is treated as a way of stopping the transmission. But by itself, lockdown is not the solution to the disease because it does not cure the disease. It's only slowing the spread of the disease. And when it slows the spread of the disease, it buys time so that we can ramp up our medical systems, we can ramp up testing and tracing, etc., so that we can take care of the disease. So lockdown is only to slow the spread of the disease. Now, there's something called the apex. That's the peak number of infections. That peak number of infections should not cross the medical capacity of the system. So lockdown prevents the number from rising rapidly and crossing the peak of the medical capacity, so that one can take care of it. So the lockdown has to be properly implemented. Unfortunately, in India, it came very suddenly on March 25th, and what needed to be done, the imperatives, those were not implemented. In India, large number of people in the cities live in very crowded areas, so we needed to decongest people, because if there are 10 people living in a small room, then you can't expect that 10 people to live 24/7 in one small room. They have to move around. They have common toilets. They don't have clean drinking water. They have to go out for that. They have to go out and buy supplies and food. So therefore, people start mixing around. And that's why decongesting people is very important. Those who wanted to go to the villages should have been allowed to go to the villages after testing. And those who stayed back, they should have been decongested on open playgrounds, setting up tent colonies, or in the school buildings which were lying vacant, etc. And then they have to be provided with the essentials, because 75 to 80% of them have said in interviews that they don't have money even to buy 1 week of supplies. Now, if they don't have income and they cannot buy the supplies, then essentials have to be provided to them. Otherwise, they'll start moving around. Then, we also needed to ramp up quickly our health infrastructure, because the disease was going to spread. And the other imperative is that small businesses which are collapsing, they had to be supported so that they did not collapse. Now, the way the lockdown was done, and suddenly people started moving and people went to rural areas, into small towns, and testing had not been done, the disease also started spreading to other areas from where it had come. So the imperatives of the lockdown had not been taken care of. That's a big problem. Now, the next issue is that the lockdown has created a situation which the globe has never faced. No country has faced this kind of a situation. This is a unique situation, and that's why the governments did not know how to tackle it. Just like in the beginning, we didn't know how to tackle it. We also didn't know what to do about this lockdown and its economic impact. And the situation that is faced is worse than in a world war. or in the global financial crisis of 2007-9. And the reason is very simple. The reason is that during a war, the production does not come down and unemployment is not there, because you see, everybody is busy fighting the war and producing for the war. So there's full employment and there's full production. Only the production is reoriented towards war production. So when I visited, say, one factory in near Leipzig in Germany, it said that during the war they used to produce chocolates and they started producing propellers for the aeroplanes. So therefore you only reorient production, but the production continues. Now, when the production stops in a situation like the lockdown, then it means supplies cannot also be delivered. So demand freezes and supply freezes. Both effects take place. Similarly, in the global financial crisis also, it's not that supplies could not be made, only the demand had come down. So therefore, the situation today is that supply lines, which are very badly stretched, across the globe, and when there's disruption, the supply lines get cut. So goods from China, goods from other countries cannot move, to the countries that need the goods, etc. So supply within the country, supply from outside the country, both tend to get disrupted, and that creates a huge problem for production. So this is the reason why, you have a situation where the situation is worse than the global financial crisis in the World War. Now, another aspect of the modern day society is that a great deal of specialization is there. And that's why the supply lines have become very long. So there's a huge division of labor. If you look at the shirt that you're wearing, or if you look at, the laptop or the mobile phone, then its parts have come from all over, it's sold somewhere, it's transported somewhere. So there's a huge division of labor. And because of that, the supply lines are very long. And therefore, the disruption due to lockdown was much greater than if, the supply lines had not been as long as they have become. Now, so what is the impact of lockdown? As I was saying, during a lockdown, one cannot move out. One should not mix around, because that's the purpose of lockdown, so that people don't mix and don't pass on and don't transmit the disease. But the poor people earn every day and they buy their essentials every day. They cannot stock up, unlike the middle class and the upper classes who can go and buy 1 month's supply, 2 months' supply. The poor people cannot do that because they don't have that kind of saving. So as soon as the income stops, they start starving, and that's why the huge migration took place, to the rural areas. These people in search of jobs had come from rural areas to urban areas, and they started migrating back because at least they felt that in the rural areas they'll be able to get food from the fields, and they were hopeful that their families there would support them. Whereas they had actually shifted from rural areas to urban areas to support their families back in the rural areas. Now they hope that it would happen in reverse. Similarly, there is the cottage sector, which produces at a very tiny level, very small units, 1 or 2 people working in cottage sector. They also don't have much saving, and they also exhausted their saving in a very short time. And that's why, when they exhaust their savings and the capital, they become very difficult to restart work. Similarly, there are a lot of self-employed people like traders, barbers, taxi drivers, etc. And they also have very little savings, and they also find that they are not able to restart work because they exhaust their capital, and therefore they are also in trouble. Now, as a result of this big problem of lockdown, the unemployment soared very high. In India, the unorganized sector employs 94% of the workforce and produces 45% of the output. Of this, half is from agriculture, and agriculture employs about 42% of the workforce. Now, in this sense, India is a unique case. Such a large unorganized sector does not exist in any other major economy. Basically, people suffered a lot, and this kind of suffrage did not take place in the other major economies. And that's why Indian economy declined the maximum out of all the major economies of the world. And what happened is that the unorganized sector, because if you cannot move out, you cannot work. So the unorganized sector, which is non-agriculture, that completely stopped. Whereas agriculture can continue to work in open areas, but that's not possible in the non-agriculture component of the unorganized sector. And we have to distinguish between employment and work. If I'm working in a factory, which has closed down. I'm employed, but I'm not working. If I'm a government servant, I'm employed by the government, but I'm not going to work. So that's why, I have distinguished between employment and work in my, writings. And I found that about 200 million people lost work in April. CMIE gives a figure of 122 million, and they say that they are unemployed. So because many people who are employed but not working, so therefore my estimate is that 200 million people lost work, because almost the entire unorganized sector, uh, which is in non-agriculture, that shut down, and large part of the organized sector also shut down. So my estimate is 200 million people lost work in April. And that's why you see the GDP calculation looks at work, not at the formal employment or the number of people on the registers of the employed. So if work comes down, then the GDP also comes down. And that's why my estimate of GDP decline is much greater than that of the other people. Something has gone wrong. It's stopped moving. Hello? Hello?
Yes.
Hello, sir. Yes, sir.
I think the screen has stopped moving. Hello?
Yes, sir. I'm here.
We can hear you, sir. I think the presentation is locked.
Huh?
The problem with the presentation.
Yeah,
I can see the mouse. At cursor, I can see it, sir.
Shall I restart the screen sharing?
Oh, yes, sir. Yes, sir.
The screen
Yes,
has
sir.
stopped. Yeah, I'll restart the screen.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So now the central bank actually tried to intervene to help the economy to go up. But the problem is that the interest rate reduction by the central bank, what is called the cut in the repo rate and the reverse repo rate, that cannot give a boost to the economy when the economy is not working. Businesses that are shut cannot produce. So even if you cut your interest rate, it does not matter. And because they're not producing, they don't need credit. So they're not demanding credit from the banks also. So what happened in that period was that banks started parking their excess fund with the RBI. And, therefore, what happened was that credit demand declined, and the credit demand has remained slow even till now. So the latest data that came out from the RBI shows that the industrial sector is not making much demand, especially the large units are not making much demand on the banks for credit. Now, the other sector of the economy, the organized sector, and the organized sector employees have fixed incomes, and they also face problem, because large number of them, according to CMIE, about 17 million of them lost employment. And therefore they lost their income also. But even those who remained employed, even their salaries are cut. Like in the media, I was told that between 10% to 40% cut in salaries took place. So the organized sector also, large number of people lost employment, large number of people lost incomes, and that's why the demand came down. And therefore the consumption was taking place only of the essential items, not the non-essential items. There is something called the discretionary items. Those the consumption of the discretionary items came down dramatically during that period, and that's the other reason why the economy further has a problem. Then apart from the organized sector employees, there are the self-employed people, and they also could not go to work, and they also lost income. Then there are the elderly and the retired people who depend on their savings, the interest earning on the savings. But the fixed deposit rates came down, and therefore their earnings also came down, and they also had to cut back on their consumption. The very rich people also, they found that initially the stock market went down, because there's a huge effect of the decline in output and so on. And when that happens, even the rich people cut back their consumption, they cut back their investment, in something called the wealth effect, that, when you feel less wealthy, you start cutting back. So in other words, what I'm trying to point out is that in the period of the lockdown and the immediate after that, when there was a huge uncertainty, the rich people cut back consumption, the organized sector cut back consumption, the unorganized sector suffered, and they cut back consumption also. So in other words, all segments of society cut back their consumption and investment, and that's why the economy declined very dramatically. Now, when businesses close down, they still have to have, certain costs that they have to maintain, their factory, they have to maintain their establishment, they have to have some employees, they have to pay some wages to their employees also. So the working capital is there and the interest payment continues. Now, there are two kinds of firms, those which are highly leveraged firms, which have a high amount of borrowing as compared to the equity that they have. And because of the high amount of borrowing, they have to pay a lot of interest payment. But when the revenue is not coming, paying of interest becomes difficult. And that's why, the highly leveraged firms are the first to fail. And then after that, in the financial sector, because, when return of the money is not coming either on interest or on the capital that was lent out, then the financial sector also starts facing problems. So, when this kind of thing happens, then, one after the other, businesses begin to fail. And therefore, the reports are that large number of small and marginal firms, which have very little capital usually, they are the ones who are failing and who are not able to restart a business once the lockdown was relaxed. Now, looking at agriculture, agriculture is part of the primary sector. And this sector, like in the primary sector, you have agriculture, mining, forestry, logging, fishing, etc. And these are done in the open area so they can continue. But what happens is that when 94% lose incomes and the part of the organized sector also loses incomes, then the demand for their produce declines. And that's what happened at the time of demonetization also. The demand for agriculture produce fell. So the price of the produce starts falling at the source. That means the farmers, like for instance for horticulture and pisciculture, floriculture, because the demand had come down, the prices fell and the farmers' incomes also declined, but in the urban areas, because of shortage of, fruits and vegetables, the prices rose. So therefore you had this twin phenomena that the consumer in the urban areas faced a higher price during the lockdown, whereas the farmers in the rural areas, they had lower incomes. And that led to a crisis in the farmers' situation because their incomes came down. You saw that the markets actually were closed and therefore the farmers could not sell their produce in the markets and they had to sell at lower prices to the local money lenders and other people from whom they borrowed. So what should have been done is that, there should have been extended procurement by the government and then that could have been supplied to urban areas so that the urban prices would have been not rising as much. And also because of the procurement, the rural prices of the food stuff that people are selling there, that would have also not fallen as much. So government did not do that in the lockdown. Now, what kind of recovery will there be? That's the problem. So I have been arguing on the basis of what happened during the Spanish flu in the period 1918 to 1920, which was the last big pandemic in the world. At that time, the second round of attack was more dangerous because more people died in the second round than in the first round of attack. And now we are into the second round and some European nations are into second and third round. USA has crossed the second round, UK has crossed the second round, but many countries are in the second and third round, So because of that, there's a huge uncertainty, and when there's uncertainty, then investment does not pick up and the consumption also remains that of the largely essential items. So the consumer survey of the RBI that shows that the consumer sentiment is only at about 55.5, whereas 100 is what the average, and last year at this time it was 105. So the consumer sentiment is way below what it was last year, and that is because of the huge uncertainty that is prevailing in the market. People have, don't have employment, etc., and that's why the problem is there. The government keeps saying that there'll be a V-shaped recovery in the economy, Now, what does a V-shaped recovery mean? It means that the economy will rise as rapidly as it fell. So when it fell in the month of April and May, it should have risen equally fast in the month of June and July, and by July end, it should have come back to where it was in the previous period. Now, no such thing has happened, and even now the economy is at least 10% lower than what it was at this point of time last year. So therefore, I've been arguing that only a U-shaped gradual recovery will take place, and it will not be a V-shaped recovery. Now, I've also been arguing that an economy is not like a rubber ball, which if you drop, it bounces back immediately, because there are real costs. There's employment, there's income, there's investment, and all of that is impacted. And because the consumer sentiment is down, and because the investors' confidence is down, therefore the economy is not recovering like a V. It's slowly and gradually coming like a U. So this graph shows that if the government was correct, that the economy was going to recover as quickly as it had dropped, then the blue line is the way it would have come. And in that case, the average rate of growth for the year as a whole would have been minus 12%. But if the economy recovers in 12 months, as the the orange graph shows, then the rate of growth will be minus 28.79%. If the economy recovers in 18 months, then it will be minus 33%. And if the economy recovers in 24 months, that will be minus 35.58%. So the economy's rate of growth is much lower than what the government has been projecting. So in a sense, if the economy falls by about 29%, which is the most optimistic, the scenario 2, then the economy would be down by 60 lakh crores of production, and GDP would come down from 204 lakh crores in the earlier year to 144 lakh crores. Now, most of this loss of 60 lakh crores will be the loss of the unorganized sector, which includes agriculture and the poor people, the marginalized section, etc. So this is a huge loss of income by the unorganized sector. Now, as a result of this decline, the government's resource position has also declined dramatically. The tax collections have declined by much more than 29%. And that's why the budget, the revised figures in the budget are lower than the actual budgeted figures. So the revenues of the center and the states will fall from about 16% of GDP to 14% of GDP. That means the tax collection would fall from 32 lakh crore to about 20 lakh crore. Now the fiscal deficit is already running very high, and that will increase further as a result of this decline in the tax collections. So government has a lack of resources. But as I said, if 200 million people lost employment during that period of time, then they have gone below the poverty line. So if we assume that the government is only going to support these people by giving them half the World Bank extreme poverty line of $1.9 per person, then calculated at 75 rupees a dollar, we require some like 15 lakh crores of rupees to support these people. Instead of giving 15 lakh crores, the government has only given about 3 lakh crores from the budget. So the government, if it has to increase its expenditure on the poor and supporting them, while the tax revenue comes down by a very substantial amount of 10 to 14 lakhs of crores, then the government only can do essential expenditure, what I call the survival package, and everything else which is inessential, that has to be left out. Now the government's package, there's a major problem with that, and that is the government still wants to attract foreign capital, and for that it is giving concessions. So the package that is announced, about 22 lakh crores, only about 10% of this is coming from the budget, and the rest of the package is loans of various kinds, credit availability, etc. So for instance, the RBI's various schemes that were announced would have provided 9 lakh crores of additional credit and loans to the businesses. But as I said, if the businesses are not working, then they don't need so much extra credit, and that's why the offtake of credit has remained very low. So the policy changes that have been announced in what is called the Atmanirbhar Bharat scheme, those policy changes, are long-term policy changes. They are the part of the agenda that the government had since 2014, but earlier because of opposition, they could not implement, like labor law changes, like changes in the agriculture laws, etc. So they're pushing through the things that they wanted to push through from 2014. But the issue is that you need to raise demand immediately. Relief is required immediately, but this Atmanirbhar Bharat package is targeting the medium and the long run. So in the medium and the long run, things will not work out if today things are not working out. And that's why, my argument is that investment will not take place unless demand is revived. And if the investment does not take place today, it will not take place much also later on. And that's why you'll have problem as far as the investment is concerned. So my argument is that when the house is burning, at that time you say, okay, I will buy, more fire engines, I'll buy, set up more fire extinguishing places, etc. But by then the house will burn. So the government's package is wrongly targeted. Now, as a result, as I said, this Atmanirbhar Bharat package, what it is doing is, it is weakening the labor further. It's pushing in changes in the labor laws where hours of work, bonus, industrial disputes, hire and fire, etc., they are all being pushed through. So labor as it is has been weak in the Indian context because there's 94% labor in the unorganized sector with almost no bargaining power. And therefore the bargaining power is going to decline further as a result of these so-called changes in the labor laws, what they call reform, what I call deform. So, in the rural employment guarantee scheme, the demand for work has increased dramatically and not enough money was given there. So it could not expand enough. And that's why people are still not finding enough work. Now, urban employment is also required, but there's no scheme corresponding to the rural employment guarantee scheme in the urban areas. And therefore, there's a lot of unemployment in the urban areas also. And as a result of all this, what will happen is inequalities will rise. Stock market is rising, but the urban poor, the rural poor, their incomes have fallen. So the inequalities are increasing dramatically. Similarly, in the area of education, there'll be a huge inequality that will take place because the poor people don't have the devices to be able to do online classes. They can't attend schools, etc. Many parents have pulled their children out of there. Similarly, because of automation taking place and e-commerce, etc., employment is going down, and also the gender bias is there. Women have lost a lot of employment. So as a result of the pandemic, because of the unemployment situation, both the employment and wages will fall. Now there are important ethical aspects as a result of all this, that we need social justice in society. The economy and the society is headed towards a new normal. We are not going to recover back to where we were, as I said, because of the kind of automation that's taking place, the unemployment that is rising, etc. The capacity also will get redefined, like in the hotels, in the metros, etc. You cannot pack people in like you did earlier. So, the new normal will be very different from what was there earlier. And as a result of this automation and so on, the marginalized people will get further marginalized, and they have not been able to cope with the crisis, and in any future crisis, they'll be finding themselves in further trouble. They were already in trouble because there was demonetization, GST, NBFC crisis, and digitization that was taking place before the pandemic hit from 2016, and that had hit the unorganized sector very hard. So the unemployed people will act as a reserve army of labor, and they will keep the wages down. So vast number of people, as has been very clear, do not get a living wage, and their wages will come down further as a result of the unemployment and the automation that is taking place, causing more unemployment to take place. And because a large number of people don't get a living wage, they have very uncivilized conditions of living, and they cannot cope with a health crisis. And this is something important because, as we can see, as we have disturbed nature, animals have come closer to the human beings, and viruses are mutating and jumping from animals to human beings. That's why in the last 20 years, this is the 7th new virus that has come. As you know, we had H1N1, we had SARS, MERS, we had, Zika, we had Nipah, we had Ebola, and now the coronavirus. So every 2-3 years, a new virus is coming. We are lucky that this virus is very virulent, but its mortality is not as high. In the case of Ebola, 50% of those who are contracting the disease died. Now, if the next virus is very virulent as well as has high mortality, then a lot of people will not be able to cope with it because very quickly, they'll get infected and they will have very severe illness. So we need to have situation for our labor where they can cope with any kind of health crisis. They can cope with stoppage of income for some time, etc., etc. So what to do? There are both macro aspects and micro aspects. So the first thing that needs to be done is that the marginalized sections who lost employment, they need to be taken care of, and that's why we need to have a survival package rather than spend money on all kinds of things or go for what is called supply side responses rather than the demand side responses and the income increase. And because you see the economy will recover slowly, therefore, work in the cities also will not be back to where it was. So even when people return from the villages, they may not find work. So we need to generate employment both in rural and urban areas. And then, as I said, we need to grant a living wage. At the moment, the wages that people are getting are not living wages. And that's why people suffer when there's a crisis. Now, as I said, also the unorganized sector will get more marginalized in employment, in education, and in health. So we need to step up, the employment generation and provision of education and health as public services. Even in terms of education, Wi-Fi should become a public good so that everybody should have access to Wi-Fi, just like everybody has access to roads. Similarly, libraries of instruments can be created so that the poor people and their children can go to these libraries of where they can get these devices on which they can do their education online, etc. So we need all these big changes to take place in public services and the uncivilized conditions that people live in. So we need to provide adequate housing. We need to provide adequate health and sanitation to the poor people. So these public services, civic and social services, need to be better structured in the society. Now, regarding the micro aspects, we have to accelerate public investment in public services so that these public services will then become part of the living wage. Once these public services are provided, education, health, sanitation, etc., then the living wage would be there. People would not live in very uncivilized conditions. We need to improve the schools and primary health centers, and for that we need to recruit staff. And there are a large number of the educated unemployed. They can be employed in education, in health sectors. At the moment, we have massive requirement of contact tracing and testing. So people can be employed in testing and tracing. People can also be employed in other related health services that are needed. And for the children of the poor, as I said, the web-based classes, they have to be accelerated, and the teachers have to learn how to teach through the web. And there are many teachers in schools are not used to teaching using the web. Only the well-off schools, their teachers may have some training, but in other schools also, otherwise the attention of the children will waver. They will not be able to learn online. Employers need to provide a place of living close to the place of work so that people don't have to travel, so that even if lockdowns come from time to time, people can still travel to their place of work where through physical distancing, work can continue. The unorganized sector, as I said, is very large. We have, what's called the MSME sector, the micro, small and medium sector. The micro sector has 99% of the units and 97.5% of the employment. So that micro sector is the cottage sector of the economy, as with very little capital. So they need to be provided working capital so that they can restart, because they have 97.5% of the employment. If a large number of the unorganized sector, cottage sector units close down, then employment will remain a big problem. Then, those workers who come back from the rural areas to the urban areas, but they don't have, the ration cards, or they don't have work, free rations should be provided to them. And this, in the urban areas where people are being displaced from slum areas, that has to be temporarily suspended until, better work and better living conditions can be provided to these people. So in conclusion, government's resource position is very badly stretched, and it can only cater to the survival. So budget completely needs reformulation so that we can focus our attention on the poor people, on the unorganized sector, rather than only try to boost some kind of business sentiment through what are called supply side responses. As you saw in the Atmanirbhar Bharat package, the public sector is being dismantled, it's being privatized. You have, various kinds of things that are coming up, like for instance, the space, the atomic energy, etc. These are things we can tackle later. At the moment, funds have to be provided to the poor people to take care of their basic requirements. Now, the economic decline is not being admitted by the government so that they don't need to do much for the unorganized sector and the poor. So we must demand that the government give the correct picture of the economy by incorporating the unorganized sector in its calculations. And the civic society needs to step in and drive changes in policies, because a lot of policies would need to be changed. The budgetary policies and other policies would need to be changed. So we don't go only for supply side responses, we go also for the demand side. Then, we need to have movements which will change the perception of the elite rulers. Our rulers are basically urban centric. They are from the well-off sections, and therefore they cater only to the urban areas, to the well-off sections, but they don't cater to the unorganized sector and the rural areas. So all these problems that are being confronted are a result of very uneven development that has taken place in the Indian economy and society since independence. And because of this, our problems have persisted, whether it be of education, health, whether it be of employment generation, and so on. So we now need to rethink our basic development paradigm. The development paradigm that we have adopted since the time of independence is a top-down, trickle-down paradigm. That has to be changed, and we have to go for development from below. So a lot of changes will take place on the nature of trade, the nature of openness of the economy. We have to protect our environment. We have to slow down the travel, which takes up a lot of energy and causes a lot of environmental damage. So all these things would require changes. And globally, it is happening that all countries are saying that the supply lines have to be shortened. That means trade will change, the nature of globalization will change. So the openness will change, and therefore there'll be a big problem. So we need to think about all these from right now, rather than postponing it to later on, because as the economy unlocks, problems will begin to manifest themselves, and then it may be very late to try and change. So we need to begin to think about these things from the present. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Professor Ankumar, for this talk and presentation. So next we'll go into the Q&A session. The audience here can post their questions in the chat box so that we can forward these questions to the speaker to answer right now. So we are also collecting questions from the Facebook live video where people are asked to post their comments. So yeah, our people can now use their raise hand option. I think the raise hand option should be available at the bottom of the screen or at the top bottom right of the screen. People can use their raise hand option to raise their hand. I can unmute them and they can ask their questions.
I think people will take time to absorb all this.
Okay.
So
I think one of the audience, yeah.
Yes, somebody's raised their hand, right?
Yeah. I asked him to unmute. Yeah, I think he's unmuted.
Sir, thank you for the more informative lecture. Actually, I have many questions, but I put it only the 2 questions right now.
Okay.
See, in the last actually the 12 to actually 15 months, that we have seen the huge accumulation of the wealth. I mean, the actually, I mean, increase in the actually wealth of Indian big businessmen, which is reported actually widely in the newspapers, and actually many reports also came out.
Yes.
On the other side, as you said in your presentation, close to 2 million job lost, I mean, during this actually 1 year.
Yes.
Why this disparity? I mean, there is no production, there is no even supply and demand also, but there is, I mean, more than 100% actually increase in the wealth. But
Yes.
actually, other side, vast, I mean, the majority of the people unemployment. But the very curious thing is that there is no production also. As you
No,
pointed out, you are
so,
actually the RBI
yeah.
report. So there is no
So-
production also. How to understand this actually
Yeah.
disparity? This is actually question number one.
Yeah.
I mean, question number two.
So let me answer this, then you can ask the next one.
Okay, sir.
Okay.
Yes.
So you see, what has happened is that the production has revived. It was down by 75% in the month of April and May, and now it's down by 10%. So production is taking place, but the avenues for investment are very few, because you see the investment in the economy has gone down given the uncertainty. So, people are saving their money. Where will they invest? Because the fixed deposit rates have come down, the real estate is down. So people are pouring their money into the stock market through the mutual funds and through buying of equity, etc. And there are some companies that are doing very well, especially those related to technology, because of the automation that is taking place, because of the e-commerce that is taking place, etc. So therefore, globally, what you find is that all the technology companies are doing very well. So whether it be Facebook or Google or Amazon, etc., and they are flush with funds, and they've invested massively in the Indian stock market also. So funds coming from abroad, from the technology firms, especially into Reliance. Reliance was the most indebted company of the country, but within a space of 3-4 months, it floated a rights issue and it got money from Facebook, it got money from other like Google, etc. They want to use a Geo platform, and therefore massive sum of money came in 4-5 months. It became a zero debt company. And like that, this funds coming from outside and the Indian well-off section putting their money. So these are all paper gains. These are all capital gains. They don't mean that the output is rising back to where it was in January 2020. But it means that, the people are investing only here, not anywhere else. And that's why even the Reserve Bank of India governor has in the last 4 months cautioned 3 times, saying that the financial sector is completely out of line with the real economy. The real economy is not back to where it was in January 2020, but the financial market, the stock market has crossed all limits. It has gone to record high. So what is happening is that there are 2 kinds of companies. Some companies will do very well, FMCG, like pharma, like technology, like telecom, etc., and their share prices are rising, and along with that, other share prices also start rising. But there are a whole lot of other companies like airlines, hotels, restaurants, etc. They are doing very badly, and therefore there is some companies doing well, some companies doing poorly. But on the whole, the stock market is rising because of speculative rise, and that's why the price equity, PE ratio, as it's called, price to earning ratio, that has gone to record high levels, showing that it's very speculative. All this movement, it's not based on real economy, as you rightly say. So that's why you see that even among companies, there are some which are doing very well and some which are collapsing. And also, as compared to labor, where 200 million people lost work and lost income, So therefore, disparities, as I said in my presentation, the disparities are rising dramatically, and that will cause crisis in the future, because demand will not be able to rise if large number of people don't have income, and if demand does not rise, then investment will not rise. And that's why this year the rate of growth will be very high on a low base of last year. But what will happen next year is that the output will not reach the 2019 level, because demand would not have revived. So the problem is that the economy is getting more and more uncertain, more and more speculative, and therefore the chances are that the economy could tank once again. The economy was already in trouble before the pandemic hit, and that trouble can continue to grow further as we go forward.
Yeah, my second question. Yeah, the
Yes.
second question related to fiscal deficit point.
Yes.
The first world countries, particularly the Western, they are, spending huge amount of money on actually the welfare schemes. During the lockdown.
Yes.
But our government, actually, Indian government is actually much worrying on stick to the fiscal, limit. And even in the newspaper also, many economists are actually recommending the government try to find a way, I mean, spending more as well as actually stick to the physical limit also. Why? I mean, which stops, I mean, actually our people, I mean, our government, okay, not to spend more on, even during this, I mean, such kind of actually the pandemic situation, despite the, I mean, demand from every sections of the society. They are actually begging the government to give the money, rice, and for everything. But still, the government is not ready to, I mean, listen. They are more actually reluctant to do this. Which stops? Actually, why? I mean, why they are behaving like this? Is there any constraint? I mean, economic constraint, or is there any actually political reason behind it? How to understand this thing?
So, there's an ideology, which is what the neoliberal ideology is based on, which says that the government should not, spend too much, and the role of the government should be limited. So, keeping the fiscal deficit low is a way of limiting the government's role in the economy. So, on the one hand, this neoliberal regime, it says that the taxes should be cut, and on the other hand, it says fiscal deficit should be kept within reasonable limits, like 3% of GDP, as was in the FRBM Act. So both these are to limit the government so as to provide the private sector a greater role. Now, monetarist theory suggests that this is the way, because they say that the government will be ineffective in the long run. Government can try and boost the economy, but in the long run it will be ineffective. That is the received thing from the monetarist logic. Whereas the Keynesian logic was that when there's a demand shortfall, then you increase the demand through government expenditures, and that will take the economy to go back up. Now, large number of economists in the last 30 years follow the monetarist prescription, the neoliberal prescription, but it's during the crisis time that people turn Keynesian. So that's why in the 2007 to 2009 crisis also, many economists started saying that before the crisis of 2007, if you are a Keynesian, people would laugh at you. And during the 2007-9 crisis, if you are a monetarist, people would laugh at you. Same thing is happening now in the advanced countries. Massive relief is being given. Like during Trump's time, $2 trillion was announced. Now $1.9 trillion has been announced by President Biden, and another $3 trillion package for the coming years is being proposed. So in other words, the fiscal deficit in the USA will be at record level of 20-25%, and similarly, as you say, for the other countries. Now, in the developing countries, the problem is that our political leaders, they are continuing to follow the old neoliberal policy of supply side rather than the demand side, and that's why out of the 22 lakh crore of the Atmanirbhar Bharat package, only 3 lakh crore was being provided to the poor people in terms of increased income from the budget, whereas the rest was all credit and loans, etc., to businesses, to restart businesses, etc. But this is a chicken and egg problem, that if the demand is not there, how will the businesses start investing more, and how will they start producing more? So the supply side, policies is what our government has also followed, and that is what the problem is. So it's an ideological thing, because of which our governments, in India and in many of the developing world, they're not, and they're always, pointing to IMF and pointing to the credit rating agencies, saying the credit rating agencies will reduce the credit rating of the country, and therefore, the loans that you get from abroad, they'll become more expensive, and they'll create a problem for investment as well as for borrowing money abroad. So they don't see that if every economy is having a high fiscal deficit, then the credit rating agencies cannot downgrade some countries and not other countries. So the government should have done that, but I think the government also had an ideological agenda of pushing through with farmers and the labor changes that they have been wanting since 2014, because they say land and labor has to be, laws have to be changed, made more business friendly. So basically, our government has been very business friendly, and it's pursuing policies which are business friendly, and therefore it's not doing what it needed to do as far as the poor people, the marginalized sections, and the unorganized sector are concerned.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
So there is another question from Sinu K.
Yeah.
So, in spite of effective vaccination, case counts keep increasing more rapid than before. Why would you say that is the case? And if we could have foreseen COVID 2 years back, but it was known to be inevitable, what economic decisions could have been taken?
Say the second question again.
And if we could have foreseen,
Your voice is breaking. Your voice is breaking.
oh, okay. So, am I audible now?
Yeah, yeah.
And if we could have foreseen COVID 2 years back, but it was known to be inevitable, what economic decisions would have been taken?
Okay. So, vaccination is very limited in India. Unlike in UK, Israel, or the USA, where a large percentage of the population is received. In Israel, of course, everybody has received, but in UK and USA also, almost 50% and 30% have received their vaccine. But in India, barely, about 4% have received one dose of the vaccine. Now, herd immunity comes at 60%. And when herd immunity comes, then the transmission gets broken. So we are very far from it. To begin with, we were doing just 1 crore vaccination per month, in the first month. Now we have extended it to about 4-5 crores. Now, if we want herd immunity in, say, 12 months' time, then we need to vaccinate out of 140 crores, 60%, that is 84 crore people. So we would have to give about 168 crore doses. Now 168 crore doses, and if we are doing, say, 4 or 5 crore per month, then as you can imagine, we'll need about 45 months, which means about 4 years time it will take for us to vaccinate to get to herd immunity. Not everybody. Now, in that situation, we will never achieve herd immunity because vaccine efficacy is only for 1 year or maximum 2 years. So after 1 year, we'll have to start inoculating those people who have received their dose again. So if it takes 4 years to get to herd immunity to get to 84 crore people, whereas we are not able to get even a fraction of that in the first year, then we'll never achieve herd immunity. So that's why the cases will keep rising until we get the herd immunity. And the problem is that, you see, this is what the pandemic has shown, that we are a global society. We are a collectivity. If the virus continues to persist, then it will keep mutating. And when it keeps mutating, its new forms may or may not be amenable to the vaccine. And therefore, the vaccine will also have to be tweaked every year. So this is a never-ending kind of a chase. And as I had said, we'll need to accelerate our research and development in understanding viruses, vaccines, and various other things as well. So, we need to accelerate our vaccination. Otherwise, we are never going to get herd immunity, and the disease will continue to persist in spite of everything. And then if it mutates, like it suddenly mutated into the UK variant, the South African variant, and the Brazilian variant, which are more virulent and which are spreading across the world and creating a problem across the world. And then if there's a talk that in India there's a double mutant which has come from Maharashtra and which is spreading. Now, if this double mutant is not amenable to the vaccine that we already have, the Serum Institute vaccine and the biotech vaccine, then it will not stop the vaccine from spreading. It will slow it down, and therefore the vaccine will be ineffective in spite of the number of vaccination going up. So we are far from getting to the stage where the vaccination will stop the spread of the disease at the moment. Also, we are not doing enough genome testing. And because we are not doing enough genome testing, we don't know how far the double mutant has spread or how far the UK variety or the South African variety has spread. And South African variety is not amenable to the Serum Institute vaccine. And that's why South Africa, which was given 50 million doses of the Serum Institute AstraZeneca vaccine, they returned the doses saying it's not effective against the South African variety. So there are many complications, and that's why we need to plan very well. We also need to continue to use masks. We also need to continue physical distancing, and we have to do massive testing and tracing. Without massive testing and tracing, we cannot prevent the spread of the disease. So these are the things that the government should have planned for. Government knew in July itself that we'd have to do vaccination in a big way, but it has not planned. That's why from January 15 to February 15, only 1 crore people are vaccinated, whereas in that period, about 10 crore should have been vaccinated. So we had planned in advance, and the Serum Institute had produced enough doses. Now we are told that we are running probably short of enough doses, and also there's something called vaccine hesitancy. People are not coming forward to get themselves vaccinated because they're scared. Because when the economy has been opened up in such a big way, then many people in the rural areas and the poor areas, they're saying there's nothing like COVID. It's only a government conspiracy. They are doing this for some other reason. They are trying to benefit, the pharma companies, etc. So, for instance, we had said that in the second phase, those with comorbidities above 45 and those above 60 years of age, they will be 30 crore of them. They'll be vaccinated by July 21st. But because people are not coming forward and the disease is spreading, so we have given up this phase 2 and gone to phase 3. Now, this shows that very poor planning is taking place. We needed to have gone straight to about 10 crore per month. Then only we could have controlled it within a short space of time. So, like we did not plan the lockdown properly, we have not planned the vaccination also properly. We have not planned for employment generation. So somehow in our country, everything is chalta hai. If we do something, we say, okay, this much has been done, that's good enough. Whereas, for a disease like this pandemic, that's not good enough. We need to really plan very well in advance. And that brings me to the second question, that if we had known 2 years back, of course we have known. We've known for a long time that pandemics will keep coming, We've also known that, in fact, Bill Gates in a TED talk in 2015, I think, had already warned that a pandemic could be more dangerous than an asteroid hitting the Earth. George Bush had warned in 2007 in a speech that, we have to worry about the pandemics because pandemics are keeping on coming. So we have known. And to be able to deal with the pandemic, we need to take care of the entire population. As I said, we have to give a living wage to everybody, so everybody is able to take care of themselves. In India, that's not the case. Large number of people are not able to take care of themselves. They don't have the money to buy supplies. They don't have the money to go for help. They don't have the money so that the children can continue to get education at a distance. And our health systems are one of the weakest in the world. In my book, I have given data on the health systems in different parts of the world. I've also given what are the essentials if a lockdown is to be successful, if we are to be able to tackle the disease. So we have been very, very woefully inadequate, even though we have known that pandemics will keep coming.
Okay. Thank you, sir. So, if there is any more question, the audience can just enter in the chat box. I think the audience can now enter in the chat box. They can enter their queries, or you can just use the raise hand option. It should be there either at the bottom of the screen or on the bottom right options. So, okay. There is someone asking, Nikhil. Okay.
Yeah, Nikhil.
Yeah, good evening, sir. My question is like, I have heard.
Good evening.
Yeah, I have heard like various economists have said like in foreign countries, if we see the model, like they go more on the production side, and same has been like tried to be implemented in the form of farm laws in India. So my question was, if we can improve our agriculture to such an extent that we present the world a model. So what's your views on this? Like if we increase the agriculture growth such that it becomes a model for whole of the world.
See, we have to look at Indian agriculture, which is very different from agriculture in the advanced countries. In our agriculture, 85% of the farmers are small farmers and marginal farmers operating less than 5 acres of land. And because in India, the agriculturists don't receive a good income, they are not able to take care of themselves, And that's why there's been protests going on in Indian agriculture for a very long time. Now the government says that we are giving choice to the farmers by opening up, the market outside the APMC mandis also. Now that also is a bit of a misnomer, because there are only 23 crops out of about 150 crops which have the MSP, but MSP is effectively implemented only in 2 crops, rice and wheat, and of course in the case of sugarcane, the price is announced. So the situation is that basically most farmers are selling outside the APMC mandi to the traders, to the money lenders, etc., who have given them the money. So they have no choice. Even if you allow them to sell, outside the APMC mandi, they'll continue to sell to the people that they were selling earlier at much lower prices than the MSP. And in fact, in Bihar, where the APMC Act was removed in 2005 or 2006, the farmers there are getting half the MSP price for paddy that they get in Punjab and Haryana. So traders from Bihar buy the produce from the farmers, and they come and sell it in Punjab and Haryana. So in other words, you see the idea that, for the poor farmers, you can have free markets, you can give them choice by allowing them to sell wherever they like, that's only theoretical. In practice, that would not happen. And what else would happen is that, initially, like happened in the case of Ola and Uber, when, a big capital comes in, it'll offer a better price. So you could get Ola and Uber at 6 rupees a kilometer. And once the local taxi stands all disappeared, then they've jacked up the price to 15 rupees and surge pricing to 22 and 25. So that's what will happen, when the big corporates come in to procure supplies. Initially, they'll offer a better price. The APMC mandis will disappear, and then the price will just collapse, because they will have the whip hand, and the small farmer or the marginal farmer will not be able to compete with the lawyers of the corporates who will haul them up before court, and they can lose their land as well, in the process. So the farmers sense all this, and that's why they say that our situation was not good before the laws were implemented. Don't make it worse, because the laws that you are implementing, the APMC will disappear over a period of time, the MSP will disappear, and then we will be in the grip of the big corporates, and we will not be able to compete with them. And therefore, they are saying that, don't make our situation worse. These laws will make our situation worse than what we are already in. So my argument is that what the government is doing is a pro-corporate sector move in the farm front, and that is not the solution. If, like for instance, in the USA, you have a minimum farm size of 250 acre, whereas in India, you have quarter acre, 1 acre, 2 acre farms, where 5 people are working, whereas in the USA, on a 250 acre farm, barely 5 people or 2 people would be working with big machines. They would have 5 crore worth of capital, whereas in the Indian farm, there'd be hardly 50,000 worth of capital. So in other words, we cannot compare our agriculture with agriculture in the advanced countries. Our agriculturists don't have access to technology, don't have access to capital, don't have access to markets. So therefore, our situation is very different. We have to worry about the employment, and agriculture has massive employment. Now, how do we take people out from agriculture into non-agriculture? Because our non-agriculture is also highly automated. So the organized sector, as I was saying, which has 6% of the employment and which produces 55% of the output, gets 80% of all investment. But that investment is going for labor displacement. That is very highly automated, so it does not generate jobs. So if you see the organized sector in 1990-91, had an employment about 27 million, of which 18 million came from public sector and the balance from the private sector. And that time the total workforce was 250 million. Now the workforce is 450 million. That means 200 million more, but the organized sector has barely expanded by 4 million. So the balance have to go into the unorganized sector, and that's why people are not able to leave agriculture and get other jobs. Also, the question of quality of education is very important in all this. So, to say that we can be, going in for changes in agriculture so that we could become a model model for whom? Our agriculture is very different. In the USA, less than 1% of the population is in agriculture. So they don't even count agriculturists as part of their census. But in India, as I said, 42% of the workforce and more than 50% of the population depends on agriculture. So agriculture here and agriculture there are completely different, and we cannot become a model for them. What we need to do is we need to make our agriculture viable, and it will be a very different model than that of the advanced countries.
Okay, sir, there is audience there's another question. I think there's a pair of questions. So, comparing to polio vaccination, the process of this vaccination is tedious process like registration, downloading app, etc. Why is it so? Is there some business behind this as well? And the second question is how to come out of the neoliberal ideology, because even when farmers protest, the government is so reluctant to hear their voice. Why is it so? What would be the solution then?
Okay. So, the problem, as I said, is if you want to get to herd immunity within 1 year, you have to do about 168 crore. That means 1.68 billion, doses. Your production is inadequate for that purpose, Therefore, you have to prioritize. Who would you do first? Who do you do second? If you do a free for all, the rich people will get it, the poor people will not get it, So without prioritization and without sequencing, you'll be in trouble. Also, we know that it's the elderly people who are the ones who are the most vulnerable, and there the death rates are very high. And that's why you have to try and cover them first and then cover the other people. For younger people, the disease may be there, but it may be asymptomatic, and the deaths are much less than that for the other. So that's why you have to prioritize, and you cannot do it like a polio vaccine. Because this will create a huge social problem. If you just opened it up for anybody, the rich will get it, the poor will not get it. There'll be black marketing also that will take place. The rich will be willing to pay much more, and they'll get all that. So I think the government did the right thing by prioritizing, but they should have started moving on it since July last year. They started moving on it much later. They should have seen that to get to herd immunity in 1 year, you will require to do 15 crore doses at least per month. Not start with 1 crore. So they messed up because they didn't plan well. So it's not a question of that we can do what we can do for polio. It's not like that. It has to be very different. You need the doses, you need the infrastructure, you need the supply lines, etc. If you don't have the logistics, you cannot vaccinate such a huge population so quickly. So it's a very different ball game, and we needed to do that. Now, regarding the second question, the government, is not listening because A, the opposition is very weak, and B, the government realizes that it can tire out the farmers, and that's what it is doing. That the farmers have been protesting now since July last, in Punjab and Haryana and so on, and around Delhi since November, and the government is not talking to them. It realizes that it can tire them out. How long can they continue to sit there? And therefore they want to help businesses, and especially big business which is entering into retail trading. They want to help them procure supplies cheap. So it's a pro-business move that this government has had. And that's why these policies are called supply-side policies, where basically the idea is to help businesses, to help their investment, and that's why you see the essential services maintenance, that which has been diluted is so that people can hold stocks, and if people can hold stocks with big money, then they can manipulate prices also. So rather than make the entire agriculture more rational by providing the farm producer cooperatives, but there also the danger is that the big business would enter and would dominate them. But if farmers producers cooperatives could be created in the control of the farmers themselves, then that could maybe help in the farming and the marketing process. But I doubt that would happen. The government's intention is very clear, that it wants to help the corporate sector to enter farming in a big way.
Is there